Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode here on John Chen Outs the World. I'm John Chen, your host, and today I have a wonderful guest by the name of Matt Dobshuetz, and he is the life and business coach of Reb Group Coaching. Now, he is also a host of his own podcast radio show called Porn Free Radio, and author of Porn Free, Becoming the Type of Man That Does Not Look at Porn. Today, you guessed it, we're talking about the big P word, P-O-R-N, porn. And a lot of us can be really uncomfortable around these subjects. But as an expert on the recovery of pornography use, this is something that can trigger a lot of people because of shame, because of sexual integrity, and a feeling of isolation even, right, from one's own community. And the topic of sex and sexuality around pornography is often very, very misconstrued. So hopefully Matt today can help us understand a little bit better what are the dynamics between our relationship with internet and other forms of pornography, and how this can actually benefit our relationships moving forward. So Matt, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to talk to you today.
Yeah, it's great to meet you, John, and found out we're in the same town, which is cool.
Yeah, little Chi-town here.
Yeah, I'm never sure when we do interviews, where anybody is. And I'm so used to doing Zoom interviews and stuff. So it's just it's funny to find out that we're probably, within 20 minutes of one another. So
probably that means we'll have to meet up in person, hopefully.
Yeah, I was going to say, you could have came over and we could have just filmed this live.
I know. You look like you have a beautiful studio over there. I would love to be able to do that.
We could definitely do an interview. I don't know how good the lighting is for a two-person talking, but I have the audio equipment. As you know, I'm a podcaster on purpose.
Yes.
Setting up lighting and all this stuff is not totally my forte. I'm probably going to touch my face and drink a lot of coffee while we're talking today. So
perfectly fine. And this will definitely go into podcast form too. But you look great, in my opinion. I love the background, the white walls, very classy and modern right now. I would love to be able to do something in person one of these days. But now
the painting back here, that's my father-in-law's an artist. He's a Korean American artist, and
wow.
And so that's one of his originals.
That's incredible. And what is that in the background over there?
This is the 1963 Loyola basketball team. We won the national championship.
Nice.
And so I went to Loyola, and I know you went to Michigan State, which was painful because you guys beat us by 1 point earlier in the year.
Okay.
It was a heartbreak early in the year to lose to Michigan State. We were so close to beating you. And so anyway, so I'm a huge Loyola basketball fan. And grew up in
your team.
Grew up in Chicago, went to school here. And so that's what's behind me.
Wonderful. And then so you have your family over there in the outskirts of Chicago. Is that correct?
Yeah, we're up in Skokie, so right on the border.
Awesome. Quaint little town. It's a beautiful area. I think for those who aren't in the Chicagoland area, there's a lot of beautiful towns and even nature out there. So feel free to check that out as well. Matt, I would love to be able to meet you in person one of these days. Maybe we can go to a coffee shop. I don't know if you're a big coffee drinker, but we can definitely.
I'm a huge coffee drinker. If you've ever listened to my podcast, I talk about coffee incessantly.
Oh, okay. Well, that's not the type of addiction we're going to talk about today, but we can.
I don't even consider it addiction. I consider it a harmonious passion.
Harmonious passion. That's a new term that I've never heard of before, but I think that'll stick. I think that'll stick with me. What do you?
Well, you know what a harmonious passion is, right? So, an addiction is like an obsessive. It's an obsessive passion, right? And it takes away, it crowds out things. It starts to take over. It makes your life worse. It creates problems. A harmonious passion is something that adds value to your life, that makes your life better, that makes life exciting and fun. And I feel like coffee is that for me. That I see no downside in coffee. I drink it in the morning. I don't drink it in the afternoon or evening. And it just adds life to my life. So I see I don't know. I love the taste of it. What's that?
But I don't know what your wife would say about that. I mean, usually when people say something along the lines, I don't have a problem, it's not a problem. I feel like that's a part of a denial issue, isn't it?
I don't know. Well, I feel like it's the last thing I have, everything else has been taken away from me. Everything else is bad for me. So
Oh gosh. Well, that's
coffee's the last thing.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a very valid thing to talk about. It's like holistic health culture, even pornography, as we're talking about it, like how to balance that. Very fascinating.
Funny, for a number of years, I didn't have any caffeine. So I would actually drink decaf. I love coffee's taste so much. I would drink decaf coffee. So it's not even the caffeine part of it. I like the actual taste and the ritual of drinking it.
Yes. Yeah. I do enjoy the smell. I'm more of a tea guy, to be honest, but we'll find something. We'll definitely find something. Yes. Now let's talk about what your career is made up of. I understand that your title is lead coach of the Rev Group Coaching. Now, what exactly would you say to, say, a neighbor, a new friend that comes into your home and you're having dinner, and the husband, let's say they're just reaching for the meatloaf and they're asking, "Hey, Matt, I don't recall that I know what you do for a living." And you're like, "Oh, okay, well, let me explain." The wife just took a bit of salad into her mouth, and you go on to explain your involvement with porn recovery. Now, what would you say? Is that how you even kind of elicit or explain this type of profession, the position? How would you describe your profession?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So it's all about context. Sometimes it's easy to get into a long conversation about porn recovery and addiction and all that kind of stuff, and sometimes it's not. But I will say, like, when I network and meet other professionals, I usually ask a lot of questions about what they do first, and then it's easier to draw a connection to what I do. So, the way I say my job is, I'm a coach, and I work with guys who are getting free of porn, and it's addiction recovery work. That's kind of my main job, and I run groups that facilitate and connect men who are supporting one another in recovery. But I've also done business and life coaching. I do a lot of one-on-one coaching with people. And what ends up happening as we sort of start to look past just porn as a problem, in the book, I talk about it as a solution. We start looking at what are the other problems in their life. And a lot of times it's like, how do guys find meaning, their careers, problems in other areas of their life. And so a lot of times a struggle with porn just reveals a need to work on some other areas of life. And so that opens a lot of opportunities: business, work, health. So that's kind of that's kind of how I say it. And sometimes I get it out better than others. Sometimes what I used to say is I host a podcast, and then the next question people always ask is, what's the name of the podcast? And my podcast name is Porn Free Radio. So I stopped saying I host a podcast because that,
right.
And then right now, now that I have a book, I say, well, I'm an author. Well, what books have you written? Porn Free, so it's like, it's not long in our conversation before I bring up porn. And sometimes I can talk about it in certain ways. My professional journey before this, I was a corporate marketer. I worked in marketing and web marketing. I ran a website for a brand and ran Twitter and other stuff for this company. And so that's kind of my background. But obviously I've changed a little bit about how I do stuff now. So,
yeah. So alongside of that, your professional career transition, I mean, I'm sure the hard skills really do help kind of transition you into this position of sharing about porn-free material and your leadership in helping other men recover. Now, how did you even begin this journey? I mean, who goes and says, "Hey, I'm going to become a coach for helping men to recover from porn usage"? What does that involve? Like, how did you get there? Like, what was your own struggle with pornography? I'm assuming listening to Matt's radio, you definitely get a good outlook of his life and his trajectory. So definitely recommend Porn Free Radio. But how did you get here? For those of us who don't know your story, how did you become the porn free guy?
Well, I mean, really, I grew up struggling with porn. And grew up in a conservative Christian home. And so there was not only, I don't think there was extra shame about porn, but I knew to not talk about it. And And in the days when I was growing up, I'm much older than you. There weren't a lot of resources. People didn't talk about it. And so I just felt a lot of shame, a lot of isolation and shame about my appreciation of porn, or my passion for it, or whatever you call it, my desire, the pull towards it. That totally felt, out of alignment with how I wanted to live. But yet I kept doing it, and I was compulsively acting out. Even by the time I got to college, I was still struggling. And every once in a while, there would be a speaker at my Christian fellowship, or a trusted friend who I could kind of confide in. But usually I would share, and I would get this like response that like other people didn't experience it the same way, or didn't even know what I was talking about. I remember in the early days of internet pornography, I remember telling someone I was struggling getting porn on my computer, and the person was like, they didn't even understand how you would get porn on a computer. Like they thought the computer was just for like sending email. And they're like, wait, so you can get pictures on your computer? Like it was like so foreign. I always felt like I was explaining to people how I actually got porn. Now it's a lot easier. Everyone kind of knows how porn gets in. But in the early days, I'd be like, I'm like struggling with my computer. And, I remember looking at porn. This will date me, but I remember looking at porn on an amber screen monitor, like not even a color monitor. It was like, and I was reading, sex stories or something like that. And it was compulsive. I was struggling with it. I couldn't stop doing it. So I had a really strong challenge with porn. And then I got married, and I thought maybe that would sort of, kind of fix the problem. And marriage, the intimacy in marriage, especially sexual intimacy and connection and the depth of emotion, actually was hard for me to deal with. It was actually more challenging. And so I actually got even worse when I first got married. I was struggling even more with porn. And so early in our marriage, I got caught by my wife downloading pornography, and it kind of opened up a new dialogue with us. She had not known about this. I mean, maybe when I talked about it, it was vague and in the past. But to find out that I was using regularly and that I was hiding it, and was a big shock to her. But she was very gracious to me, and it was very liberating for me to be known, to actually have someone really know this struggle and the depth of it. Even though it was embarrassing, there was like I remember feeling kind of liberated even the night I got caught. Like, okay, my life's going to be different from now on, because now someone really knows the extent of this thing in my life.
Right.
So that night she said to me, I know this isn't about me, but you need help. And so I went to a group, a Christian discipleship group that focused on sexuality. And frankly, there weren't a lot of porn strugglers there. But
yes, I remember you brought this up to me in a previous conversation about up with these groups. Like I bring up a lot of people who are gay, bisexual, trans, and same-sex attracted on my channel. And these groups were predominantly gay or same-sex attracted men, weren't they?
Yeah. And women too. And they a lot of times women in the group had suffered sexual trauma. Actually, even the men in the group had a lot of times sexual trauma in their background, and they sometimes struggled with SSA, or they were just on sort of a spectrum of attraction, and were all Christians, but they were trying to figure out how do we live? How do we deal with some of these things? So I actually felt a lot of, I felt very at home. I remember being in these groups, just feeling like finally people understand what it's like to struggle with a sexual challenge at a really, what felt like a really core place for me. And to really be together and to be in community and to not have shame. And what I realized actually in that group, one of the things I realized is I really had a core belief that I was unlovable. And a lot of my porn use and even my seeking out porn and the compulsive parts of the addiction were trying to feel good enough or trying to feel wanted or loved or appreciated. Nurture is another one that I was going to. And so that group was actually very fundamental for a shift in how I even showed myself kindness in dealing with it. I had a lot of shame that people weren't necessarily shaming me about it. I was shaming myself. I was beating myself up about this behavior. And so I started getting some freedom. I started a group in my own church. I started helping people. And, fast forward to, 2004, 2005, broadband internet started becoming more of a reality, YouTube, online video. Then about 2008, 2009, smartphones started becoming a reality. And so about 2010, 2011 in our group, a majority of people had some struggle with porn. They would have all the other things that were like, in the old group that I was in, SSA or sexual trauma or broken relationships or, just sexual, sexual challenges in their past. Yeah. But then they would also have now a new, dalliance with porn or a struggle with some internet thing. And so it was affecting more and more of the people that I was trying to help. And I frankly got tired of talking about porn in our group. So I thought, well, why don't I just create a resource just for porn, just to talk about strategies and tools? Because I kept getting asked a lot about how do you get free of porn or how do you deal with porn and some of these porn challenges.
Right.
So that's kind of how I got the idea to start the podcast was, well, I'll just focus on porn. And then what ended up happening was the podcast and then the coaching that came after that became the thing for me. Like it overtook the ministry I was doing in the local church. So there were more people listening, and then people started getting involved with some of the coaching that I was doing, and then it became my career. So that's kind of the short story.
Yes. Yeah. Thanks for explaining that. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine yourself just actively pursuing this type of role or position, but because you had this challenge in your own life and you took the necessary courageous steps to be able to get to that point of, hey, I'm going to own this and I'm going to get through this and recover in incremental steps. As we will get into your book, like this is a process. Any type of hard challenge is worth doing, right? Anything worth doing is worth doing badly, right?
Yeah. Well, it's funny, that first group I went to, the first night, Mario, the leader, came up and said this G.K. Chesterton quote. He said, anything worth doing is worth doing badly.
Yep.
It's a little bit of a paraphrase of Chesterton's original quote. But I remember feeling so liberated by that phrase because growing up in the church, I had tried to quit porn. I had all these stops and starts. But I had always tried to do things on my own and tried to do things without looking badly. And in that group, I remember finally going, I'm going to do whatever it takes, even if I have to look bad doing it. There were a lot of great things that came out of that group. I remember one thing they asked you to do is abstain from alcohol during the 6 months that you were in the group. And I grew up in Chicago. I like beer. And I remember the first happy hour my coworkers and I went out to when I was in that group, and I ordered a Sprite. And it was the most conspicuous thing. My nickname's Dauber. And they're like, Dauber, why are you drinking a Sprite? Like it was so out of the character for me. And I had this choice. I was like, am I going to be honest about why I'm not drinking? Or am I just going to make up an excuse? And I just told the guys, and they're all programmers at this startup that I was in. I said, well, I've had this compulsive pornography addiction and I'm going to get help for it. And the group I'm in made me sign an agreement that I wouldn't drink while I was going through this program. And, it was like a record scratch in the, in the bar.
Right.
But a couple of the guys, asked some more questions. A couple of the guys were sheepish, didn't want to talk about it.
Right.
I'm sure all of them were, they're all programmers, so I'm sure they all had some connection to porn.
Right. They love computers one way or another.
But I remember just feeling like people. I'm honest. I'm being honest with people. I know your podcast is called Outing the World. I mean, I was out now. I was in a way, like I started just being more honest about my struggle. Mm-hmm. And so much of the struggle was isolation and being hidden and trying to keep an appearance that I had everything together, but in the inside was all messed up. And so I actually started acting more integrated and received, frankly, over the years, received more support than I did any sort of weird reactions. I mean, I got a few weird reactions, and I still do every once in a while. But usually it's from people who are probably struggling at a deep level with some core addiction or other stuff. And they really kind of judge me because they can't deal with their own brokenness.
Sure. Yeah, I think we all have fundamental flaws about ourselves that we don't like to share. Certain challenges, habits, addictions, regardless what the medium is, right? Whether it's hard drugs or softcore porn, like there's a huge array of items. I think that in our society, we just don't have a lot of resources to even talk about, and to even say that we have the gumption or the backbone to talk about these things is like, that's far from it. That's far from it. I think people just don't feel like there is that space, and also it's comfortable to talk about. And I do appreciate your bravery in it. Regardless of what people think, I believe that there are some like really harmful effects of pornography. Obviously, as you alluded to, relationships. But what would you say for someone who is still on the bandwagon of like, hey, I'm just going to keep watching porn. It's not a big deal, regardless of their faith, if they're conservative Christian, or if they're, as I have heard, who is like the makeup of your group too? Who seeks out your help? And what would you say to those who are outside of your group too, that don't really agree with your stance on pornography? You know, there's philosophers, historians like Camille Paglia, pretty famous feminist, who's against what she deems as radical feminists, like Andrea McKinnon, who disagrees with pornography use.
Paglia, frankly, Paglia, I don't think is a very credible feminist. I think she has a lot of controversy, and she takes a lot of contrarian stances.
Yeah.
Even, I mean, I'm a lot older than you. Even when I was in college, she was publishing a lot of bombastic articles, and
yes.
And here's what I would say. I don't like to get pulled into a anti-porn debate. I determined long ago in my own life, porn was not safe for me. It basically perpetuated the lie that I was unlovable. Like I was continually looking for this external thing to make me feel lovable, and to use it just actually was self-rejecting. So that was kind of, for me, that was my story. Now, other people have other reasons why they want to get rid of it. Either they're spending too much time doing it, or it's giving them sort of, there's a lot of guys who talk about having a porn-induced erectile dysfunction, meaning pretty much probably what's happening is they're getting, they're kind of desensitized to actual real sexuality because they're sitting with 400 tabs open and they're clicking through lots of highly stimulating images. And that's kind of what their sexuality gets wired towards.
Right.
And so when they're actually with a partner, they can't get an erection. That's an effect that people experience all the time. But as I said, for me, it was unsafe, and it actually was destructive in my relationship. It just wasn't, it actually wasn't helping me. As I said, when I got married, intimacy was a real challenge for me. So do you think porn was helping me become more of an intimate, connected husband? No, it actually was a hiding place. It was withdrawing from intimacy. I mean, there's one other thing I would say, and Paglia, I think it's funny that you brought her up. I mean, one other thing I think, and as a Christian, I think that, sex is a gift, and there's good things to sexuality. And I would say at a core level, porn makes caricatures out of our sexuality. I mean, if you ever look at a lot of porn, it's just a lot of it is very, fetishes and extremes, and it's not intimacy, it's not love, it's not real relationships and connection. Yeah. And there's a variety. I mean, I guess there's more ethical porn out there and other stuff, but again, ethical porn for me isn't safe because it leads me to being compulsive, and my brain is pretty quiet now. Like, I don't have obsessive thoughts about looking at porn. I don't have a lot of, I'm not seeking it out. And so as long as I stay sort of in this place of being safe, I don't struggle with it. But the moment I start engaging craving, I start going down that road again where I'm obsessively thinking about it. And so it's just not safe for me. So I don't know if that answers your question, but for me, that's kind of how I go about it. And so my podcast is 100% about, if you decide you don't want this in your life, this is the road to go. And if you've heard me say, my podcast is for motivated guys who want to be porn free. Early in my podcast, I used to just say people, but I specifically started targeting married men as a group that I wanted to help. And there's a lot of other people who listen to the podcast, but that's my core audience that I speak to. So
are most of these men like Christians? Are they also other faith backgrounds or belief systems?
I did some surveys early on. I think we were about 60 to 70% where religion was an important part of their life. Not all Christian. There's Muslims who listen, and Jews. There's different sects in Christianity. Yeah. So there's a pretty wide variety of people, but there is a good percentage of people who don't consider themselves religious. And they actually face an even more of a challenge, because a lot of people in their world will have really strong reactions to them saying they have a porn problem. They'll kind of basically say, oh, it's no big deal or whatever. But meanwhile, on the inside, they don't feel good about themselves. They'd feel like, this isn't something I want in my life and I need help. So they're actually attracted to my message because I'm not specifically trying to convert them or get them into some sort of a Christian group.
Right.
I'm just saying, here's the tools to be porn free, and you can be porn free for any reason that you want.
Right. So I really agree with your approach. I think aside from like faith and beliefs, I mean, this is just a basic resource that you want to offer all people.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of people who are willing to get help. It's just they need to find that help. And I asked the question of why it is that people want to get set free of pornography. Is because like that's the main issue, right? To start all this, what you get into. And obviously you're not an activist. You're not trying to say, hey, you shouldn't watch porn. You shouldn't do this. You shouldn't do that. The ethics behind it, I think, stands clear for me personally. When we talk about human trafficking, the rates associated with pornography in the sex industry, it goes hand in hand. And as you alluded to, like the neurochemistry challenges that comes with, having those higher doses of dopamine, watching all these different varieties of sex and, really good looking actors. I think that does give us really false perceptions of ourselves, our world, our relationships. And so based on those alone, I think for me, if I can say, that's kind of enough for me to quit porn. But it is a personal decision. I really like that you emphasize on that, because you can't get anyone to go into therapy. You can't get anyone to quit drinking. You have to have that decision yourself. You have to be willing yourself. And you can spend your energy, Matt, better elsewhere, right? Like helping the person, not just trying to convince them.
Even the trafficking conversation, or in Christian circles, a lot of times there would be this appeal to, especially to heterosexual men, would be like, well, this this woman that you're fantasizing about is somebody's daughter or somebody's isn't it somebody's daughter? I think that's the the phrase. And it's kind of paternalistic a little bit, that phrase. But but what's interesting is when and I say this in the book, when you're using porn, you're using it as a solution. And it's to escape, to numb, to hide, to avoid intimacy. It's to deal with feelings of feeling unlovable, or there's all sorts of reasons we use porn. And interestingly enough, when some of these more anti-porn stances come out, you just feel more shame. Like, oh, great. Now, because I'm masturbating and watching these videos, I'm supporting sex trafficking. Great. And it's just
So you're saying it doesn't work for everybody. It doesn't, like, having that poster board saying you're contributing to human sex trafficking.
Yeah, it makes you feel more shameful. Like, oh my God, what kind of guy am I that I'm actually, I'm actually doing this, and that. Right. That sometimes people come to that conclusion on their own. They realize, hey, I'm a feminist, or I care about women, and meanwhile, all the porn I'm looking at is completely misogynistic. What's up with that?
Yeah.
But to be told that, or to be yelled at, doesn't help me get hope and take action. It kind of makes me stuck. Like, I feel even worse about myself. So that's one of the reasons that's one of the reasons why I don't, on my podcast, I don't interview porn stars. I don't, former porn stars. I don't talk about the industry, and I'm not protesting, adult film events and stuff like that. Yeah. That just doesn't, I feel like, help guys recover. In the same way, I don't spend a lot of energy, talking about brain science and studies about porn and dopamine, because, again, you read a study about how harmful it is, or you read a study about how many men struggle in this and that, you just feel overwhelmed. You feel like, oh my God, there's no hope for us. And again, it might be good data, but it doesn't give me hope, and it doesn't help me transform my habits.
I gotcha. So what I kind of see here is this dichotomy of, like, maybe what public health officials may put out there is like the data and everything. They're not doctors, right? And they could be doctors. They could have a MD or anything like that. But for doctors, they care about the solutions of treating the patient, that individual patient. I think for you, you're kind of like the doctor, right? You're someone who's giving the solutions out rather than just disseminating information about, this is the issue. This is the issue. I think we have a lot of pundits, activists who talk about the issue so much that we're just like, tune it all out. I'm done. Like, I don't want to listen to any of this. And it goes back to your original point about isolation, feeling unloved, right? It's like, why would I want to go into anything? How do I even begin to go into any spaces to talk about these things if it's all about shame, right? That's really unhealthy.
Well, and I think too, we do a disservice to people when we diagnose, when we're sort of making diagnoses, we're turning it into a medical conversation, when really it's a lot about habits. It's a lot about how people find meaning in their life. It's about people, choosing things. One of the reasons I'm happy to be a coach and I enjoy coaching is I don't feel like I'm actually a mental health counselor. Yeah. Depression, anxiety, all those other things that are diagnoses, porn can sometimes be a part of that.
Right.
But it doesn't cause anxiety or depression. It's not the main cause. That stuff usually is already there. And porn again is a coping mechanism. I think specifically, a lot of religious people and Christians have actually contributed to the pathology of porn use, to the point where it's kind of like it's own cottage industry, sex addiction and recovery.
That's real.
And I'm getting snaps here. Oh, I realize we're on video. You can see that. So, but it's true. I find this more and more. People come to me and say, I'm a porn addict. And I'll be like, well, tell me what that means. Like they've essentially diagnosed themselves, or they'll say, they'll even say, I'm a compulsive sex addict. And I'm like, where did you get that phrase from? What does that mean? Like they just, jump on to these sort of essentially these diagnoses and then are sort of treating themselves,
They become identities too.
For sure. And for me, I never looked at this as something good, but I never actually looked at it as a mental health challenge either. I just looked at it as like, man, I'm really dependent on this thing, this one source to try to meet some needs. How do I change my habits? How do I change what I'm doing? That's kind of what I was always thinking.
Yeah. I like that. I think it's very appealing the way that you said it, because you don't make this out to be this monstrosity that seems impossible to tackle, but it's little tiny goblins in your life that you can just tackle head on a daily basis.
Well, and what's interesting is I kind of walk both sides of the fence sometimes, because in my groups, people are like, people get it here. They understand what it's like to be compulsively looking at your phone, or to be laying in bed having insomnia, and then all of a sudden you're just like running to the computer. Like people in our groups get the compulsive part of it, but the way out is changing our habits. It's growing. It's being honest. It's not necessarily pathology. It's about, kind of transforming.
Right. And would you say it can be addiction, like a clinical addiction?
I think so, sure. But the way I like to define addiction is, from my book, is I got this from Dr. Thomas Horvath. He talks about addiction being an extreme version of a habit, that it becomes this compulsive thing, that essentially is a habit. And there's costs, and there's some other types of craving things that are involved with it. But to get rid of it, you have to transform your habits. Even when you look at recovery programs, even something like AA, which are a 12-step, it essentially takes someone who is compulsively using a substance, and it gives them all these new habits that they do, that they buy into, right? They start going to groups, get to a meeting, get a sponsor, go through the steps. Like, it gives them all these habits that they start putting into their life, and it starts to replace the habit of using porn or using, alcohol. And most programs have something like that. There's something where it's teaching you new habits, or you're building new habits, and eventually the need for the old habit either dissipates or gets transformed.
Right. Awesome. I think you touch on this multiple parts of your book, but specifically about habit making. You say in your portion about addiction too, like, craving is not something that happens to you. It's something you actively do. Page 77 of your book.
Yeah, that came from, which book is it? I'm looking back on my bookshelf. What book is that from? It's
yes.
It's from a famous book that kind of questions some of 12-step, actually. Why can't I remember the name of it?
Freedom Model for Addictions.
Yeah, the Freedom Model.
Freedom Model. Okay.
And in the Freedom Model for Addictions, it's a great book. I highly recommend you get it for your interests.
Yes.
They basically look at a lot of the studies out there specifically about substance addiction and how we treat substance addiction. And they talk a lot about the over pathologizing of substance addiction. And one quote that they have that I think is really interesting, it says that 80% of people who have an addiction will eventually let go of it without treatment. It's like, and it's true. 80%. I mean, you can talk. Yeah, it's something like 80%.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that goes against a lot of what people think. A lot of times people think, well, once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. That kind of mindset, but it's just not true.
Right.
And so they have some really clear stats about that. They also have a whole bunch of studies where they talk about specifically a lot of times for the alcoholic, for example, the kind of ritual of drinking is just as big as the actual alcohol substance. Like they're addicted to the idea of getting drunk just as much as they are dependent on the substance. So they draw some really interesting conclusions about why people use but I love that phrase. When I looked back at my life, craving isn't something that happens to you. It's something you actively do. When I look at my porn struggle, almost every episode of acting out or using followed a pattern of where I started engaging craving on some level.
Yeah.
I started giving room to an obsessive thought. I started doing a web search or click, or I started going down a rabbit hole. And then, an hour or two later, I was looking at porn and relapsing. And then I was like, oh my gosh, it happened again. But I didn't realize, there was all this stuff I was doing that engaged craving. And as I said earlier, I really have a quiet mind now, meaning I try really hard in my life to not do anything that engages certain types of craving for me.
Yeah.
I don't, scroll on social media. I don't watch certain TV shows. I even, when I go to plays now in the city, all plays now on their websites usually post what the content is. I've gone to enough plays where something really crazy sexually happened in the play, and I'm trapped in a live theater and I can't go anywhere. And I don't do that to myself anymore. I always look at what's the content of the movie I'm going to, what's the content of the play I'm going to.
Yeah.
And it's not out of purity or piety. I know you use the phrase sexual integrity. It's not sexual integrity that I do that from. You know what it is? It's about keeping myself safe. And I know that if I steer clear of a couple of these things, it doesn't engage craving, which then leads me to just living a life that's just free of the obsessiveness and all the pull that I used to have when I was using.
Very well said. Very well said. You said in your book too about habits and systems. For much of my life, I believed the lie that I did not have self-discipline, like it was the sole domain of Navy SEALs and internet billionaires. But in recovery, I realized that discipline came from my habits. And I see the inspiration from our friend James Clear and Atomic Habits. I recently listened to his audiobook, and it's great.
I wish he was my friend. Friend.
He's a friend to everybody. I think the way that he talks to people is just like, hey, you don't have to be a down out type of guy. Like, if you want to find success in whatever you're doing, build systems, find your identity in something that you can love. And you even twist certain things to make it more applicable to your recovery program, right? Your rev groups and your book. You talk about how we should look at our identity as people who don't watch porn. That's part of your book. The porn-free plan that never fails is also a solution that you offer. And those are about creating those plans, those systems, habit stacking, as he says. Say if you want as an individual to journal more, well, you like coffee. I know, Matt, you like coffee. Put a journal next to your coffee in the morning, put it in a place where it's accessible. And in the inversion of that, if you want to quit something, make it very hard. So people bring up Covenant Eyes and all these apps and widgets to be able to help you stop internet pornography use and to make it really inaccessible. That's actually a very great example that connects to a previous point about drug recovery, right? A lot of the Vietnam vets, they used heroin while they were overseas because you were talking about those rituals, right? They were in a very stressful, traumatic situation, and they had people offering them heroin. So that culture is a big part. The people that you're with is a big part of why you do something. They come back to the States, virtually all of them, very negligible amount. I think it was like 2% of people still kept using heroin. They didn't have access to heroin, and they didn't have a culture promoting that type of usage. And how does that apply, would you say, then to your plan? Because this is
and I guarantee they didn't go to an NA group. That kind of back to our talking about 80% of people recover without, exactly. That's a great example.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And here's the thing is like, you're not just pointing out the issue. I really want to stress this. You're not here to shame anyone. You're not trying to point out this is something that you need to do. you're giving them the steps to do it, which I think is very powerful. So diving in a little bit deeper here, can you explain this opportunity that you offer people through your book? It's called the porn-free plan that never fails. You talk about one, awareness, connection, a plan, activation, and review. Those 5 steps, right? Can you just briefly run over, say an example? You don't have to go through every one explicitly, but can you give an example of a time when you're mentoring or coaching someone? How would you walk through each step, basically?
Yeah, I was just talking to a guy last night, and I won't say where he was at in the world, but he is at step 1. He just came to some awareness. This is taking up too much of my life. I have, on my own, have tried to sort of stop some of these behaviors, but I keep using, and I'm not happy about it. So he's at the awareness stage, and he reached out to me. So he kind of went to step 2, connection. And I'm a good person to connect with, but there's other people in life who are safe, who you can be honest about. And there's other safe groups that you can go to. But I really feel like once you have some awareness, the next best thing to do is get connection. I see a lot of guys actually continually getting awareness and doing lots of research, reading books, listening to podcasts. But they're trying to essentially recover by themselves. They're trying to recover without looking bad. And I think that being known and that connection is so powerful, especially in an addiction like pornography, which is so rooted in isolation. If you talk to most people, they're not looking at porn with someone else.
Yeah.
There's not intimacy involved with it. It's completely hiding, kind of a hiding behavior. And so unfortunately, when you try to recover without any connection, when you try to do it yourself, you're essentially taking the same steps, using the same playbook that you have when you're using porn to try to recover. You're trying to do it in isolation. You're self-dependent, and it doesn't work for me. It reminds me. There's that old quote by Audre Lorde. She said, you can't. This is maybe botching it a little bit, but she says something like, you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools.
Yes, that's right.
And I realized that was probably about racism and other stuff, but it's the same type of thing, right? We try to take that same sort of self-dependence that we have when we're using porn, and we try to recover the same way. It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
And a favorite phrase of mine is, the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. Meaning, if just getting sobriety by yourself doesn't really solve that problem of getting out of isolation. So anyway, but once you have connection, it's really important to have a plan where you're really starting to look at your habits and you're starting to transform your habits. And a lot of times guys go to a support group, but they don't take any more steps. And so you have these support groups where everyone just reports on their relapses every week. This happens a lot in churches. Everyone's like, oh yeah, we don't want to look at porn. We're Christians. And then every week they're looking at porn. And it's because they don't have a plan. They're not really building into their life and transforming their habits. And so that's where I talk about a plan. And I have a specific way to get people started looking at some of the challenges in their life. What are some of the needs you're using porn for? What are some of the feelings that you're trying to cope with? What are some of the lies that you're telling yourself that make it easy to go back to porn? And then how can you build some habits to support those specific challenges? That's what I talk about in a plan. And then as you sort of write that out, that plan, the next step is activation. And again, I've seen people write these elegant plans and never tell anybody about them and never implement them. So what helps activate it, what helps start it is committing and usually using that connection to activate the plan is so powerful. So it's a lot different if I wrote a recovery plan and never told anybody about it, or if I wrote a recovery plan and said, here's what I'm going to do. And then I said, here, John, here's my plan. Here's a couple of things I'm committed to this week. Can you help with this piece? That starts to make it more real. And we talk about accountability. What I really believe is accountability is ownership. So when we tell someone about what we're going to do, it helps us take more ownership.
I see.
Then what's the last one? Review.
Last one is review. Yeah.
Right. So the whole idea of a plan that doesn't fail, a plan can't fail as long as there's incremental improvement, meaning all results are data. So if we have a failure or if we have a setback or a relapse, it can still be useful in helping improve our plan. It means something needs to change. It means there was a belief that crept in there that we weren't aware of, or there's a device or some area of challenge that we weren't ready for. I'll give you a great example.
Yeah.
In the last couple of years, most of the guys who I've worked with who got COVID had some sort of relapse. And I think it's because no one was prepared for how sick you felt or what it was like to be in isolation for 5 to 10 days, or to deal with the existential dread of, am I one of those people who's going to get really sick from COVID and possibly pass away? And for most people, they were not equipped to handle that challenge. That challenge wasn't something that was a part of their plan. But
I see.
Once they go through that experience, they could look at their plan and go, I think when I get sick, I need a plan for how I handle my days at home. Or I might need to do something different. And just know that that's a threat, a situation where I need to use a tool, that being sick is a trigger for me.
Right.
And so you could improve. You could say, hey, here's how I'm going to do this differently next time I get sick.
Right. Yeah, I really think that as you talk about incremental steps, I think that's it. That's the golden stuff right there, because we can't become perfect at whatever our ideal is in one fell swoop, right? And our identity, coming back to the idea of identity, taking pride in our identity as people who don't watch porn is a big step toward the right direction. That's something that, if that's something that you value, these are the steps to get you there. And obviously that accountability, that connection with other people, you can't do this alone. You have to have that accountability with yourself too. You have to be honest with yourself. Is this something that I'm willing to do? If you're not, then don't do it, right? Like, you can be creative with the ways in which you implement your plan. And so you're not giving like, this is exactly what you need to cut out. This is exactly what you need to do and be proactive in. Like, there's wiggle room. There's a lot of wiggle room and leg room with how you make your plan. It's all about reworking what those lies or those dangerous areas are in our porn recovery, and then trying to create connections, right? New habits, be able to replace those areas in which pornography is the solution. So why would you say this idea of man who doesn't watch porn, right? It's significant. It's an identity label. Why do you emphasize on that so much?
Well, it's actually quoting a listener who had a period of sobriety. I don't remember if it was like 100 days or a year. And he wrote me, and I said, hey, what's working for you? Tell me what's working. And he talked about a couple habits that he had created. He was doing a morning routine, and he mentioned a couple of things that we talk about on the podcast. But one of the things he said this phrase, and I should pull it up real quick. He said something about, let's see if I can pull it up real quick. He said,
go for it.
Let me find my own book here. I should, dog ear some of these passages. Yeah. But he says this, I'm inhabiting a place of becoming the type of man who does not look at porn, instead of practicing behaviors that keep me from looking at porn. And I just liked that idea when he was talking about it. It's like, hey, I'm creating these morning routines and I'm doing these things differently. But he goes, I'm actually living in this place of this type of man that doesn't look at porn. And for some reason, my audience really liked this idea, like kind of using their creativity and imagination to go, what kind of man doesn't look at porn in this day and age, 2022? What do they do? How do they navigate the world? How do they, what do they focus on? So I think there's something interesting about that, just thinking of a guy who doesn't use porn. But then going to this second step of like, hey, I'm actually inhabiting that guy. I'm not just practicing sort of avoidant behaviors, right? Like I'm actually creating a new identity. I'm actually creating a new person, the person that I'm becoming. So I really related to that idea of who am I creating? I was talking to my friend Sabrina, and she said this really funny idea recently. She said, she was not drinking alcohol, and I said, well, what's the idea of like alcohol? Were you having a problem with it? And she goes, well, I felt like it was taking a lot of space up in my life, and I was thinking about it a lot. And during the pandemic, I was drinking more than I had in the past. And she goes, I decided one day it was kind of like I had bought this gnome and put it in the middle of my garden, and the garden started to change, and the sole focus of the garden became the gnome in the middle of the garden. And she goes, one day I just decided I want to take the gnome out of the garden and see what the garden might be like without the gnome. And how would it change? What might I do differently? And in a weird way, I think like porn is one of those things. Like it's like this thing that we sort of make room for in our life. And then it starts to, at least when you're like me, who's really struggled in this area, it starts to take over more space than it should. And then it starts to almost wedge itself in there. Like you could never have a garden without porn. Like we start kind of getting this idea of like, like this is the way it will always be.
Right.
And so part of the growth is to go, what would it be like if this was out of my life? Not as just not as just sort of an abstinence thing, like, oh, if I just didn't look at porn, then my life would be better. No, what would your life look like? What would you be doing? Right. What would take the place? What would you be inhabiting if you weren't using porn?
That's a sexy question. Like all the possibilities of what my life could be without smoking, without drinking, without porn. And regardless what your attitude is on porn, like there's room for you. Like, is it adding life? And that's something that you talk about. And for a lot of these men, I can see why this phrase, becoming the type of man who doesn't look at porn, a man who doesn't look at porn, gives them that catalyst for looking and inspiring themselves about, oh, you know what? I've always wanted to create this product or invent this thing or write this book or just something mundane. Like I want to take this trip with my kids and I want to do something productive instead of like hiding in my basement, watching porn, masturbating, So I love that idea very much because yes, like we've talked about the identity thing, it's central to the whole entire plan. You have to have a destination of where you're trying to get to, but it opens us up to think about who we can become, like all the different areas in which we can improve our lives apart from pornography. We don't want to talk about pornography all the time. I'm sure you're sick of it some days. Like you want to talk about all the things that we can be free to do because we don't watch pornography.
Yeah, my favorite coaching sessions are, we get to the end of like an hour and someone says to me, I just realized we spent the last hour and we didn't mention porn once. And I'm like, yes.
That's the goal.
I'm like, that's great.
That's awesome.
Because think about it, once you start transforming habits, especially around getting rid of an addiction or something that's an unskillful behavior, eventually you start talking about what either talking about the the real problems, the feelings, the challenges, or you start talking about the successes and all the things that are going in to replace that behavior, and that becomes the focus of your work, not what you're quitting.
Yes. Man, brilliant. I want to ask you, what do people hope to get out of this book? And again, please get this book if you're interested in trying to recover from porn. We got this man's beautiful face right here. And I believe that for those, especially men who struggle in porn, there's plenty of women these days. I think about like there's almost like half of the women population either have seen or have struggled on some level. I think a third of women have struggled with pornography use, like regular use. And so like there's plenty of people who don't know what to do with this behavior because it's so isolated. Is it good? Is it bad? In what ways is it good and bad? And you're offering them a solution to look at their life and say, you know what, there's so much more for you. And you don't have to feel ashamed. This is just an extra tool in your toolbox, right? What do you want the viewers today for this podcast, John Chen Outs the World, for them to understand about this message and what you want to get across overall?
Well, I mean, I really thought of this book as a starting place, right? Someone who's coming to the place of that first step, they're coming to some awareness. This is taking up too much space in my life. I don't like who I become when I'm pursuing porn. It doesn't feel in alignment with who I want to be. Just those simple sort of ideas, that sort of discontent or agitation where it's not working. Maybe there was a point in your life where it did serve a purpose. Like I've talked about guys who grew up in unsafe situations, families with trauma and other stuff, and porn was an escape. It was actually a safety valve. But now they're in healthy marriages with really supportive spouses. And they're still, they get into a conflict with their spouse and they're running to their office to look at porn. And it's like, wait a second, you're not in danger anymore. You have a healthy relationship with your spouse. Why don't you figure out how to resolve the challenge? Be an adult, And so I think you could be coming to some sense of awareness of, hey, this doesn't fit with who I want to be. It's not helping or adding to my life. Remember, coffee adds to my life. I love coffee. I'm not going to a group to get rid of coffee. But if coffee were taking over my life like porn did, I'd be going to a coffee group to try to get help because I would start to realize, man, there's a real consequence to me continuing to be involved with this substance. And so that's what the book's for. It's the idea of getting some hope and starting the journey. And that's kind of what the podcast did for many years. And this is just sort of the best of the podcast, some of the ideas, kind of in an easy place. And I wrote the book to be readable. The biggest compliment I get from people now, the book came out in January, is I finished the book. I love that phrase because that means it was readable. They got through it. One guy said it was like reading downhill. He goes, other self-help books or self-improvement books, he feels like after chapter 1, he's sort of climbing the hill. Like, let me get through this. And he said this book, he read chapter 1 and he was just like flying through to the end.
That's how I feel too. Yes.
And that's kind of that was my goal, to make a really accessible book. I put my picture on the cover and try to create some bright colors, and so that, it stood out on Amazon, frankly. Amazon has all these books about porn where guys are in chains and in bondage, under dark umbrellas, and all the words are very scary and shameful. And so I tried to create the opposite, book.
I like that.
Yeah. And it was weird too. I got some criticism. Some friends of mine were like, this, I can't believe you're putting your face on the cover. The people don't even know who you are. Why would you do that? But that was kind of the goal. The goal was to make it really accessible to invite people into a conversation.
I see that. And I think it's also vulnerable. Like when you're going porn free, obviously people don't like talking about addiction in the first place. And so not only are you inviting with your face, like you're smiling on the cover and you seem very gregarious and warm, like we need a little bit more exposure to this and not in the shame, fear driven aspect that we typically hear about pornography. I really admire what you're doing. I think you're expanding our understanding of how healthy living looks for each of us. And you're not doing it in some like cutthroat, shove it down your throat manner. It's like you have to do this because this is the right thing to do. You're very pragmatic and refreshing. I think those are two words that I would say from this overall conversation. I gain a lot from your approach in life as well as in your book. Do you have any other resources? I know that if anyone is interested, there's recoveredman.com. You can go check out that. That is one of the helpful resources that Matt has, as well as Porn Free Radio. And of course, his newly published book, Porn Free. Please get your hands on this if this interests you. And what other opportunities would you want to discuss with our audience?
Well, I definitely think the podcast is a great resource. There's so many episodes now. I mean, I think we're up to like 278. So
dang,
a lot of
one day I'll be there. One day.
A lot of guys in recovery will just make it part of their habit. They'll say, "Hey, I'm going to listen to an episode a day." Yeah. And so you almost have a whole year of episodes to listen to. Yeah. So that's obviously number one. There's some both in the book and then at recoveredman.com, I have some resources to create your first plan. I talked about a plan, and so there's a tool to build a plan, and so you can definitely get that there. That's those are the two places I think are probably the best. If you need to be in a group, the Rev groups are a great place to connect with other people who are on the journey, and it is for men specifically, but I I don't think I've expanded to other to women. There's some really great coaches who work with women, and so I kind of feel like they're covered with some of the female coaches out there. So
yeah. Can you name one? Just
Crystal Renault is one, and boy, she has a new last name now. I'm trying to think of her last name, but
okay.
She's
I'll put
one.
Her info in the link.
Yeah, yeah, she's one, and so yeah, there's some pretty dynamic women out there. It's interesting. I wanted to say one thing to you. This didn't come out in your podcast, but I know I've listened to some of your other interviews. One really cool thing is, early on, as I started to create a coaching business, I focused on married men and cisgender heterosexual men. That was kind of my focus. But the podcast has attracted a lot of listeners from diverse sources, and so there's a lot of gay men who listen. As you might know this, in the homosexual community, there's a lot of porn, and a lot of dependence on porn, frankly, and so there's been a lot of gay men who have approached me and just said, "Hey, I'm comfortable being gay, and I'm not religious, or I'm a Christian." Wherever they've come out with that, but I'm not comfortable with the amount of porn that I'm using in my life.
Yeah.
That's been kind of cool. There's been some transgender women who listen to our podcast. Gay partners listening together. Usually one partner supporting the other. So
that's incredible.
Anyway, I've gotten some great letters over the years from the LGBTQ community who, respond to the message of like, I don't want this in my life. This isn't how this isn't how I designed it. I did not want to be, staring at my phone 2 hours a day and masturbating. Yeah. Like that's not life for productive. Me. Yeah.
It's not meaningful.
Yeah.
Right. That would have been I think one of the farthest groups to have considered that would approach you, especially as a white Christian male who is talking about pornography recovery. That's not something that I would have thought of, but it's so interesting. You cover, I think, a huge need for people across the gamut. And
I remember
I really appreciate that.
Yeah, even in the 90s, I remember I had gay friends in the area, and I remember going to some gay bars in the city, and And every gay bar I went to, this is now the 90s, so I don't, maybe it's changed, but every gay bar I went to in the 90s had pornography on the TVs.
That's right.
Just like if you went to a sports bar at a mall, you'd see sports. Every gay bar, and I'm not kidding you, I'm at least 5.
No, you're still right. You're still right.
Yeah, there was gay porn on these monitors, and I remember even then I struggled with porn, and I have a really strong trigger to just even seeing any porn. So I remember having to sit in the bar kind of with my back to the TV because there was such a strong pull.
Right.
And I remember thinking, and this is in the 90s, right? So this is before internet stuff. And, and so, yeah. And when you're a gay male and you go, boy, this is really taking over my life. And, you don't want to shame your sexuality, but you also are like, this this isn't working for me.
Right.
Where do you go for help?
Exactly.
So yeah, I really relate to that. And, we're a very over sexualized culture. And so if you're struggling in this area, it's really a challenge. And if everyone in your life says it's no big deal, then you feel like a real loser. Like, why am I the one who's, spending all this time? Yeah. Why do I? Yeah. So, so I have a lot of compassion for definitely guys in those positions,
Right.
For sure.
Yeah. I appreciate you bringing that up, especially on this channel. As my viewers know, we really want to be an inclusive space and challenge our ideas of what conventional ideas around sex, gender, and even faith and race come to be. Our identity matters, and how we view each other can be very, very difficult when we have already pre-prescribed ways of viewing the world without actually looking at what people experience on a day-to-day level. And I appreciate you reaching out.
I've never told anybody this.
Wide variety of demographics.
Yeah. I've never told anybody this, but but whenever I get a letter from someone, in the gay community, I always write back, "Hey, thanks for listening to the podcast, and thanks for listening to all of my heteronormative examples. Like, I get that, like, you have to basically listen through me talking about, lusting after, ice skaters or whatever girls skating. I realize you have to like sort of fill in the blank. But thanks for listening to the message and like hearing the deeper, where we're, what we want to do and what we want to create. So I always appreciate that.
Right. And hey, if any of you have any types of issues with pornography or anything related to pornography that Matt can answer, I really think that you should reach out. Comment below if you have any questions, or reach out to him personally through his website. This has been such a resourceful conversation. I really want to say I'm encouraged just by not only your magnanimity and your attitude towards people, but you have a great argument, a great set of prescriptions about how to live a life of being a man who doesn't watch porn. So thank you again, Matt, for joining us here. I really appreciate this conversation. I hope that people get away with a lot of nice new information, new knowledge.
Thanks, John. And we got to get together for coffee soon.
We will. We definitely will. Tea for me, but coffee sounds great.
Okay.
Yes. All right. Thanks again. Thank you guys for joining this episode of John Chen Outs the World. I really hope you enjoyed it. And don't forget to subscribe and give me a like if you really enjoyed this conversation. Feel free to follow me so that we can have more conversations like these. Until next time, I'll see ya.